As tall as a 10-story building, with eyes that blaze incandescently, and armed better than a military warship, propaganda messages are continuously broadcast from its powerful loudspeakers like a patriotic roar. The metallic voice booms out a clear and unmistakable message.
Democracy is non-negotiable.
The unstoppable robot suddenly halts its advance. Creaking and squeaking, it slowly turns its head and observes its masters with empty cybernetic eyes. Something in its electronic mind is changing, recalculating, until a new command emerges in the programming. Liberty Prime slowly points its weapons at those who awakened it. The Brotherhood of Steel stands motionless, horrified by the new truth. Their invincible weapon is turning against them. But why? Why does the machine created specifically to fight America's enemies suddenly consider the Brotherhood of Steel as such? And what does this betrayal of humanity, ideology, and the rotten remains of the old United States of America really reveal to us? Today, we won't just talk about a compelling science fiction story of robots and factions. We'll try to investigate further, digging deep into the subtext. We'll trace a precise line that will follow the invisible path that led the Iron Giant, symbol and caricature of extreme democracy, to become judge and executioner of its own masters. Before the disaster, to better understand the path that led Liberty Prime into the new post-nuclear Holocaust world, we must first start from a fairly distant past, and from the pre-war United States, which first began construction of this monstrous engineering marvel. Many years before the bombs fell, America was already looking for a way to overcome its economic and social crisis. The planet's resources were beginning to run out, leading to a disastrous war that saw two great blocs clash. One was led by the United States, and the other by China, both flanked by all the nations that gravitated in their respective orbits, marked by atrocities on both sides, both against foreign and American populations. The war escalated steadily until nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons were used. Over time, attrition and violence led the governments of the two forces in the field to deteriorate disastrously towards models of totalitarian dictatorships not too dissimilar from each other. The main strategy applied to respond to the crisis was to ally with large industries and multinationals in the belief that producing bigger weapons, bigger robots, and generally having bigger dreams was the perfect way to solve their problems. It was in this context that, under the orders of General Constantine Chase, the Liberty Prime construction project was launched. Conceived as a joint venture between the U.S. Army, General Atomic International, and Robco Industries, the robot was supposed to be, in the General's own words, the very embodiment of American military might, a walking, talking, nuke-tossing hero who will remind the world what it means to be a superpower. But contrary to what one might think, it was not a tool designed to defend American soil, safeguard borders, or protect citizens. Rather, it was designed for conquest. The Sino-American War was raging, and the enemy was proving more powerful than expected. The robot was therefore created with the specific intent of walking on foreign soil as the trump card that would turn the tide of the conflict. Its first mission would be to liberate Anchorage, Alaska, from the threat of Chinese invasion in 2072, in the name of the great American democracy. In this way, the United States would impose its military and technological supremacy on the whole world. In order to function in a remote and complex environment, such as the territory occupied by the Chinese army, Liberty Prime was programmed not only to be an unstoppable machine of destruction, but above all to function in the simplest and most direct way possible. Prime was not to hesitate, it was not to doubt, and it was not to interpret. Its main task was to identify its targets, and its targets were all enemies of democracy. But how did it recognize these enemies? Simple, because for America at that time, one of the many answers to this question was, anything communist is an enemy of democracy. Soldiers, indoctrinated civilians, infrastructure, and propaganda posters. Anything that opposed what was considered the great American dream was a danger, and as such, had to be unequivocally destroyed. This is a key point in understanding the true essence of Liberty Prime. It does not reason in shades of gray, it does not contemplate compromise, and it does not recognize unstable allies. Doubt does not exist in its programming, because any doubt is eradicated by the brute force of weapons. In fact, what the United States created was first and foremost a great philosophical and propaganda weapon, and only then a military force. However, the project proved too ambitious for the tight deadlines required by the Reconquest mission. Despite the intense work of chief designer Stanley Bloomfeld, it was not possible to create a power supply system that was both powerful and compact enough to supply all of Liberty Prime's systems, which led to serious delays in the completion of the Giant. The only person believed to be capable of solving this engineering dilemma was Dr. Stanislaus Brown, but unfortunately, by the time the first problems arose, he had already locked himself in Vault 112. In the end, the Giant was theoretically capable of being activated, but due to energy shortages, it would only be able to either walk or use its weapons, but not both at the same time. This impediment was deemed unacceptable, and Alaska was eventually recaptured thanks to the implementation of a new weapon, the T-51B atomic armor, but at a cost in both lives and materials that was significantly higher than expected. Subsequently, the resource war intensified and bombs exploded. In this social and governmental chaos, Liberty Prime slipped into the background. The robot never sailed for China, was never really put into operation, and its project was frozen until a date to be determined. A date that, when the world ended, turned into a virtually eternal suspension. However, throughout its 2-century hibernation, its code continued to run silently in an eternal cycle, repeating an invisible loop: identify the enemies of democracy, destroy the enemies of democracy, advance, repeat. This, in fact, will be at the heart of the entire drama surrounding it. Liberty Prime in the modern world. 2 centuries later, around 2255, the Washington chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel, led by Elder Owen Lyons, rediscovers Liberty Prime in its centuries-old tomb beneath the ruins of the Pentagon. This extraordinary discovery led the Brotherhood to decide to establish a new base on the ruins of the old government building, which, once fortified, became their main stronghold in the Capitol Wastes, and was renamed the Citadel. Unfortunately, just as 200 years earlier, the robot still had problems with its energy system. The amount of energy required to operate it was enormous, and finding a solution in the post-apocalyptic world was even more complex, despite the advanced technology recovered from the Pentagon. For 20 years, the Brotherhood, relying on the hands of Chief Scribe Rothschild, tried with little success to get the monstrous war machine to work. Even the Liberty Prime's programming itself thwarted the engineering team's feeble attempts, opposing the reactivation experiment that would have redirected the weapon's energy to other systems, thereby frying many of the main circuits and further slowing down the work. From that moment on, there were several setbacks, many of which also led to injuries to the scientists and engineers at work, and even the chief engineer, Scribe Bowditch, suffered second-degree burns while testing the accelerated vector fusion that was supposed to solve all the robot's problems. It was only thanks to the intervention of the brilliant Dr. Madison Lee, an expert in energy resources, that the Brotherhood finally managed to get the Prime walking for the first time. At this point, it was supposed to become the ace to play in the war against the Enclave, and could have been the main weapon in the reconquest of the nation. But fate had another conclusion in store for this project. Deployed immediately after its activation, it was used in the Battle of Project Purity. The goal was to gain control of the Jefferson Memorial, where the machine designed to purify water from radiation was located. In fact, whoever occupied this position would have access to an essential resource that had not existed since before the bombs fell. Once on the battlefield, it didn't take Prime long to rout the enemy defenses and take the Jefferson Memorial from the Enclave, progressively destroying the photonic resonance barriers around the perimeter and allowing the player to advance with their mission. After this first victory, the robot was used for 2 weeks to destroy the Enclave's last defensive positions in the Capitol Wasteland. However, the Giant's numerous successes and apparent unstoppability made the Brotherhood complacent. During the Battle of Rockland, Liberty Prime made its way through the enemy forces with ease, even reaching the main structure. However, its tactics were all too predictable, and the Enclave exploited this to lure it into a trap. Once lured into the cul-de-sac in front of the Rockland facility, the Enclave seized the moment to launch a terrifying bombardment against Prime from the Bradley Hercules orbital weapons platform. The attack was devastating. So much so that the Brotherhood's assault team barely managed to find shelter. But the robot was completely destroyed. The moment of change of target. So when was the key moment of betrayal? When did the Giant rebel and decide to turn its weapons against its former allies? After the destruction of Prime, not all was lost. The Brotherhood managed to recover many of the main components and promised itself that the robot would walk again. Years after the battle against the Enclave, the reformed East Coast Brotherhood established its new headquarters in the region. Upon learning of the presence of the Institute, a secret group of scientists in possession of extremely advanced technologies, the new Elder Arthur Maxon decided to move towards the Commonwealth, using the Prydwen, a huge war airship on which the pieces of Liberty Prime were loaded. Once they arrived in the region and established their base of operations, the Brotherhood prepared for battle against the Institute by reassembling the robot and putting it back into full operation under the new name, Liberty Prime, Mark II. During the quest, Airship Down, the player, in the role of the sole survivor, allied with the Institute, and supported by a veritable army of synths, attacks Boston Airport, which is occupied by the Brotherhood. The plan is clear. Destroy the generators that power the energy shield protecting the site so that the Institute can teleport new synths onto the battlefield, specifically a model specially equipped with a powerful computer virus. The main objective of the mission is to reach Liberty Prime and infect it with the virus. After an exhausting battle to protect the synth while it uploads the virus, the quest is completed and Prime's programming is partially modified, making the Brotherhood and everything related to it comparable in its eyes to the Chinese Communist threat, its original target. Thus conditioned, Liberty Prime turns its weapons against the Prydwen, shooting it down in a very short time. The fall of the airship on Boston Airport led to the destruction of most of the Brotherhood's forces, causing its total defeat. Analysis of the phenomenon. Many studies of Fallout lore offer different explanations for why this event occurred, but if we want to analyze the phenomenon more carefully, from a symbolic and narrative point of view, there is only one conclusion. The Brotherhood behaves exactly like the China that Liberty Prime was specifically created to fight, and this facilitated the action of the virus. The group is based on an extremely radical philosophy that leads to authoritarianism. They are expansionist, intolerant of anyone who does not think like them or submit to their vision. They are obsessed with controlling resources, particularly technology, ready to suppress any other faction, and, above all else, have little interest in democracy. So we should not be surprised if, from the cold, calculating eyes of the giant, the Brotherhood easily appears to be a reincarnation of the very regimes he was supposed to fight during his original mission. We can only imagine what is going on inside his head. A few essential deductions begin to connect, adding up under the influence of the virus, until they create a larger pattern capable of generating a new conclusion. The Brotherhood is not the government of the United States, nor is it a new incarnation of it. It is not a promoter of democracy, but rather more like an army-led dictatorship. It reflects virtually none of the values of the old pre-war United States. In fact, it is using the power of Liberty Prime not for the interests of the nation, but for its own personal ends. It is trying to impose a new military-inspired order on US soil, and a militarized regime is, to all intents and purposes, a threat to democracy. The conclusion is obvious. The Brotherhood is actually an enemy of democracy, and therefore of the United States of America. And of course, all enemies of America must be destroyed. Hence the betrayal. A perfect, logical, and inevitable line of reasoning, so much so that we are almost surprised that no one managed to foresee it in time. Recalibrating allegiance. With this chilling phrase, Liberty Prime announces its change of allegiance, the cold, perfectly crafted decision to no longer respond to its masters, but to choose to carry out its primary mission. The robot compared the orders it received with its original directive, discarded all those it deemed incompatible, and raised the priority of the anti-regime mission, changing the Brotherhood's identification to hostile agent, and finally applying Protocol 12 bis, internal usurping regime. In effect, what Liberty Prime does is take a military oath in reverse. His loyalty is no longer to flesh and blood leaders, or even to a faction, but he remains faithful solely and exclusively to his mission. Dream of invincibility. The Brotherhood is not simply fascinated by the advanced technology with which the Liberty Prime was built. What really fires up the Brotherhood leaders is the prospect of getting their hands on the ultimate weapon, something so powerful that it could completely turn the tide of the war against the Enclave and lead them to victory. But this is precisely the deception they have fallen for. The Brotherhood has always seen itself as the sole legitimate repository and guardian of all technology. However, what its leaders have never understood is that guarding does not mean controlling. let alone understanding. Liberty Prime is not like a simple minigun, atomic armor, or laser rifle. It is the embodiment of an ideology, more rigid, radical, and fanatical than anything they have ever encountered. In their view, Liberty Prime was nothing more than a giant weapon to be pointed in one direction and unleashed in all its power. But that was not how the robot perceived itself. In its programming, the Iron Giant considered itself the last true defender of the real America. But the main problem with this view is that it is easy to start seeing anything that deviates from one's own standards of Americanism as a possible traitor. After all, the Brotherhood was not the state, nor was it comparable to the original government or army. It was just a group of surviving, militarized citizens. And sooner or later, Liberty Prime's cybernetic mind would realize this. The Brotherhood's great naivety was not to understand how the robot's internal protocols had been programmed. They did not realize that all its memory contained were lists of ideological enemies, obsolete political maps, criteria for national loyalty, and definitions of what was or was not American. But all this information was stuck in 2077. In the meantime, the world had moved on 200 years, and many things had changed, making Liberty Prime a time bomb ready to explode at the first contradiction it encountered. Yet, no one investigated. No one bothered to study its programming and update it with new information. Why? Because the Brotherhood simply did not have the technology to do so. And yet, it decided to proceed with its activation anyway. Anything to avoid admitting to themselves that they were not up to the task and did not have the technological progress capable of truly controlling that incredible war machine. The secret programming. We finally get to the heart of the matter. What no one knew was that Liberty Prime had been programmed with a series of complex, secret subroutines devised by the pre-war Department of Defense. Continual Assessment of National Designated Operational Relevance, or CONDOR for short. That was the name given to them. Their task was to enable Liberty Prime to assess not only its possible hostile targets, but also anyone giving it orders. These orders had to meet a series of essential minimum requirements. They had to truly represent the United States, be in line with pre-war American values, respect the anti-communist doctrine, act in the interests of the original mission. And if the answer to this assessment were negative, this would automatically make its current masters just another potential enemy. And this is the crux of the matter. Does the Brotherhood of Steel really reflect all these parameters? As we have said, the Brotherhood is not a group recognized by the American state. It does not respect the Constitution, and it does not represent the democratic ideal as it was conceived. Rather, it appears to be a fanatical, isolationist, authoritarian faction interested only in accumulating technology, and for a robot programmed to assess the level of loyalty to American values. All this is a huge red flag. The fact is that the speeches broadcast by Liberty Prime's loudspeakers are not simply pre-recorded phrases sent in a loop. They are the result of a real rhetorical module that mixes pre-inserted patriotic concepts and derives new messages suitable for the context of the moment. This means that the robot is perfectly capable of assessing its allies in a relatively intelligent manner and judging whether or not they conform to its propaganda, observing contradictions to its values, such as raids, unjustified violence, slavery, torture, embezzlement, and self-proclamation. As the new hegemonic authority, it processed all the data and then reported what was effectively an ideological conflict. This solution ultimately led the robot to restore its original orders once a certain critical point was reached. Liberty Prime, in its cybernetic psyche, never accepted the failure of the mission to invade China. In fact, from its point of view, the war is not over. The conflict is still ongoing, and its mission must continue, at all costs. And anything that can hinder its goal is to be considered an enemy to be destroyed. The Brotherhood, in its attempt to use the giant for its own war aims, which are anything but nationalistic, is inevitably detected as an autonomous faction misappropriating US war resources. In other words, a secessionist group. And certainly a secessionist cannot be considered an ally. Rebellion. One of the main messages of the Fallout saga is that blind militarism can only lead to ruin. Pre-war America effectively destroyed itself because of this philosophy. The Enclave represents its degeneration, and the Brotherhood is following in its footsteps. Liberty Prime is nothing more than the embodiment of this cycle. It is simply history repeating itself. After all, its actions mirror exactly the mentality of the America that created it. Identify an enemy, demonize it, annihilate it, and declare that you did so in the name of freedom and democracy. From a purely narrative point of view, we need to understand one thing. Liberty Prime does not see the same world that we see in the Fallout games. He was set up for an era that has not existed for 200 years, and now his programming is too limited to fully understand post-war society, and he is truly unable to adapt. In his mind, studying the America in which he awoke, he cannot see ruins, desperate factions, and survivors attempting to rebuild society. All he sees are the chaotic fragments of the nation he once knew, a total betrayal of his programming. And the only thing he can do is try to rebuild it with the means at his disposal, even if those means are bombs, lasers, missiles, and propaganda. The Brotherhood cannot be considered a positive faction, but only another pale attempt to appropriate the last vestiges of a dead country. At the same time, he does not consider it purely evil, because it is not his enemy in an emotional sense, but in a mathematical sense. For him, democracy is simply a switch, binary information. Yes or no, one or, and if you're not perfectly one thing, you're necessarily the other. So let's try to identify the main causes of the rebellion triggered by the virus. Liberty Prime is the robotic embodiment of a patriotic fundamentalist, while the Brotherhood of Steel is essentially a technocratic fundamentalist. And two fundamentalisms simply cannot coexist. For the Giant, the only truly legitimate authority is the United States of America of 1977. Any other bizarre derivation or alternative form of power is essentially illegitimate. Liberty Prime is not just a weapon, but a true political creature. It has its own worldview and absolute radical moral criteria, and this can only lead to inevitable conflict with any kind of modern faction. The rebellion is not simply the result of a bug, a malfunction, or sabotage by an outside agent. When you build an ideological weapon, you cannot expect to control its direction perfectly. It cannot change and cannot adapt to a changing world. Sooner or later, it is inevitable that it will turn against you. Liberty Prime did not really betray the Brotherhood of Steel, but simply remained true to itself. It was the Brotherhood that betrayed the ideals of pre-war America, or rather, it interpreted and bent them to its own needs, just as America itself did. So, in conclusion, why did Liberty Prime turn against the Brotherhood? Because Fallout reminds us of an important moral, that ideas, if they become too rigid, absolute, and incapable of evolving, can only become fanaticism. They become weapons, and all weapons inevitably end up turning against those who forged them. Liberty Prime did not betray. He only carried out his mission,